Hello, Ruth. Good to see you.
Good to see you. So glad you're back.
Thank you. Thank you. Baruch Hashem. Okay, I think we can start. Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see the faces I'm seeing. And if I can possibly just plead for unseen faces to show themselves if you feel up to it. I know one doesn't always feel up to it, but now I can see all the people that I'm very happy to see. It really helps me to talk to someone rather than to a blank screen. Before we start, I've been asked to announce that we change the clocks here in Israel next week, but not in the States. So there'll be a 6-hour difference rather than a 7-hour difference. You can work that out. It's a bit beyond me, but I'm sure you can work it out. Okay, and so with a deep breath, a really deep breath, we begin again. I'm almost speechless in terms of what we have to talk about today. We're talking about the beginning, how it all started, how this started and that started and that started. The word lahachil, which is like lahatchil, is used several times in Breshit and Noach. And I feel that we are officially going to be talking about Noach, but how can we start without something about creation? That is, our parsha really has to do with destructions. It has to do with deconstructing the world that God had created. And we always seem to start our studies on the left foot. That is, we always start with a destruction. And what I want to try to do to start with is to connect the two, to suggest that creating and destroying are not in two different worlds from each other. They actually live in the same world. The Midrash unforgettably describes God as Borei Olamot Umachrivan. It gives me the shivers every time I read it. That God creates worlds and destroys them, and creates and destroys. And that's what God did before he ever came to create this world, says the Midrash. So suddenly our attention is being caught. And I want to talk a lot about attention. Suddenly we're being fixed, we're being magnetized to think in very large expanses. If it isn't enough that we have to think about the creation of the world stage by stage by stage, we then have to look to watch it gradually, stage by stage, falling apart over the course of many generations, as we'll see. The Mabul was just the climax, according to Kabbalistic and Midrashic wisdom. So that these huge expanses of time and of experience, of human experience, right? Not enough that God did it with one world, but he actually had done it with several worlds. There's a series of worlds that God tried out, and he didn't like them. And that's more or less how the Midrash puts it. Lo hana'ali, something like that. It's an Aramaic word. It doesn't give me pleasure. This world does that. No, that won't do. Almost, without any ethical content to it. It's not because they're so wicked. It's almost aesthetic. God looks at the work of his hands. He's made a world, and like an artist, he said, "Nah, no good. I don't like it." Off it goes. And that then is the prehistory of our world, which gives us an unnerving sense that this is what God does, really. And somewhere creating and destroying are part of God's repertoire of what we might call creation in the largest sense. That in order to create something, as artists know, and we are all artists, in the sense that we all create something, whatever it is, we are creative. You probably wouldn't be in this class if you weren't. In that sense, we know that we often are dissatisfied with our first work, and we throw it away and we try again, and or we throw away parts of it and we try again. So that kind of improvising with the work of one's hands, that one's hands are always doing this. They're creating, they're forming, and they're throwing away. That's what God is now setting the stage for that. God is the creator with a capital C. And he is talking to the creative in us, I want to suggest, so that we can engage with this theme in its doubleness. The first thing that I want to point out is that when God does create the world, I was literally, I think in my old age, I'm getting even more sensitive to the words of the Torah. And when I heard Bereshit read in Beit Knesset last week, yes, I was shaking a little as I heard these words. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. And then in Pasuk Dalet, no, Pasuk Gimel, the first thing really, first creative act, Vayomer Elokim yehi or. God said, let there be light. Vayehi or, and there was light. Vayar Elokim et haor ki tov. And God saw the light. Now, that's the most extraordinary description of God's attention being focused on the light. It's not just that he made something good, or even as we tend to read a little carelessly, day by day of creation. Vayar Elokim ki tov. Yeah, it was the third day, it was the fourth day, and God saw it was good. We don't pay attention to that, because what God saw then was that he approved of it. Good, good, good. That these pass muster. But this first one is he saw the light, that it was good. He saw that the light had goodness in it, that there was a goodness in the light. And God is clearly impressed in some way. Vayar Elokim ki tov. You didn't have to have that sentence. Right? He made it, and then he differentiated between the light and the dark, because in some way, when you come to that kind of lovable light that seems to stand for something that warms your eyes, that makes you feel something, you don't want darkness mixed up with it. Right? So let's keep the light and the dark separate. Now, God could do that, but it turns out that human beings who are in the image of God are faced with a much more difficult task of keeping the light separate from the darkness, and often that's not the way it goes, that the light and the dark somehow go together. But God here sets a kind of primal example. And then God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. Vayerev vayevoker yom echad. That was one day, not the first day. Right? Everyone notices this. Didn't say Yom Rishon. It's not the first in a series. It was a unique day. And I'm going to be talking about the word echad quite a lot. Echad, one day. So immediately Rashi and the Midrash move away from the obvious meaning. They obviously want to discuss this word. Why doesn't it say first in order? Just one. And talk about Yechido Shel Olam. That was the day of God, when there was only God. Every day after that, God will begin to distinguish between everything in the world. And it's already starting on the first day. The light and dark have been divided, but that's not, it's of a different order, that division. And so this is the day in which God is Yachid. He is alone. There is nothing else, or there is everything in potentially. And everything is in that first day. Everything comes out of that first day, because there is only one God and everything comes from him. So there's a kind of metaphysical hypostasis there, that God is put in that special place of oneness. And then God proceeds to create the world, and at each stage, every day, says Kitov. Until the time, he says, he creates the human being. And then we read, it was Tov Me'od. You remember. What was Tov Me'od? So the Midrash says, Vayar Elokim et kol asher asa. His attention now went with a kind of a broad scan. God made a broad, what's the word I want? scan of the world. He looked at everything he'd created. Right? That's a different kind of attention from focusing in narrowly on one thing. And he finds the whole in one comprehensive stare. Excuse the word, but that's what I mean. A kind of almost blank stare, not looking into the details, but what emerges from that wholeness, very good. Tov Ma'od. And the Midrash here says demurely, Ma'od ze Adam. It's the same word with the letters displaced. Yeah, Ma'od Adam. What makes the world not just good, but intensely good, almost painfully good? Yes, Ma'od. Another Midrash says Ma'od is Malach HaMavet. That's a bit much to throw at you right away. I don't know if I want to stay with that too much. The angel of death is called Tov Ma'od. I'm not going to pick up the full implications of that, but just to say that Ma'od is treated here as something that's a peculiarly human experience. That human beings, because of Adam, there is intensity in the world. Everything else can be good, can go about and do what it has to do in the world, without that kind of almost overfull, that bulging, you know what I mean by bulging? That bulging sense of things that you can't quite contain what is in you. And that comes because of man. And that's man's experience. That's human experience. It's almost too much. It has in it a too muchness, a very much, which sometimes is too much. I can put it like that. That's what the human being is capable of. And also, it's a difficult thing to bear within oneself. So we start off then with a good world, which turns out to be a very good world, in God's vision. God looks at it and his eyes see it, right? There's no reference to his eyes, but it's clearly, that's what we're, the quality of attention that he gives it. Until the human being is created. And the next thing is that God says, Lotov. Yes? Lotov, anyone complete the sentence? What's not good?
Heyot Adam levado.
Thank you. Heyot Adam levado. It's not good for the man to be alone. Lotov. So again, there's that sort of primal still relation to the human being, which leads the Midrash and Rashi to read like this. It's most unexpected. I might have thought that God is concerned. He's looking hard at the human being, a sort of narrow focus on the human being. And he's saying it won't be a good life for him if he's alone. He really needs someone else. Ezer connector. No. What the Midrash really wants to say is something of a different order. And that is, if he is alone in the lower worlds, and I am alone in the higher worlds, that will be very unhealthy for him. To begin to create in himself godlike pretensions, godlike fantasies, that he is alone and supreme and great, and there, B'Tselem Elokim, yes, in the image of God, right? That from the beginning, God lets us know, but he doesn't let Adam know. Notice, he doesn't say it to Adam, that he wants to create this man in his image. Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmeinu kidmutenu. In our image, in our form. I won't go into the Kabbalistic meanings of that, but he says it as it were to himself. He's thinking it. That's what he says. And then he indeed does it. So if you have a man who's in the image of God in the lower worlds, alone, this man is going to start rolling fantasies. This man is going to take himself too seriously. You need a woman, ezer kenegdo, a counter force of some kind. Someone who will be with him but against him, who'll cut him down to size, who'll give him trouble. Yes, you know all the silly jokes, which are not so silly, about how much men want to live a bachelor life. They want to live alone, because then you can do what you want to do. What does Rex Harrison say there in, you know what I mean, that film? Why can't a man be like a whatever. In any case, why can't a woman, in other words, suddenly he has this other, which is also him. It comes from him, but it's disturbingly other, and it drags him away from a very lovely fantasy, that I can just do what I want. There are many artists who have spent their lives rejecting the women they live with and family, turning their backs on it because it disturbs them in their work. That's a very concrete example of what I want to say. There is a tension. The woman will create the tension in a man's life. Right? That's nowadays, I think the tension is more mutual. I don't know if that's a gain or a loss. That now two people in the marriage have this tension of the work, what my ego wants to produce in the world, as against others, the wide focus. So the pure focus, the narrow focus of attention against the wide focus of attention. There is a wonderful book that I'd like to recommend, or at least at any rate, I want to tell you that it's going to be very much on my mind this year. I've sort of selected it as to give me the theme for this year. It's called The Hidden Order of Art, and it's by Anton Ehrenzweig, Ehrenzweig. It was written quite a long time ago. I don't remember the date, probably mid-20th century. He was a psychoanalyst, I think, certainly very interested in psychoanalysis. And he writes there, basically, I can get to the very basic idea, don't want to spend a lot of time on it today, on how the artist sees with both a narrow focus on the details and a wide focus, right? This blank stare, which is like a reverie. He's in a reverie. He doesn't see the details anymore, and all he sees is the comprehensive vision of the whole. And when one is looking at works of art, and especially those trick works of art, I will bring an example next week, Blineder. When one's look, there are many puzzles like this. Look at the picture, find the dog in the picture. Now you can only find that dog if you in a way glaze out everything else. If you're looking from thing to thing, you're looking from object to object, you will not find the dog. You will find the dog if in some way you move back from that kind of very focused vision and you allow yourself to scan. It's kind of scanning, and suddenly there is the dog. In among all the dots, there's a picture full of dots, and suddenly there is the dog. That is a necessary doubleness that we need when we look at a work of art. On the one hand, we want to appreciate all the details, but if we want to understand something of a different order, what is it really all about, then we need to kind of move away. You see in art galleries how people move away, and they, in a way, obfuscate. They blur out the details because they get in the way of the main thing. Now, if we come back, I wanted to give you one example of this. It comes actually from a very different area, from the area of nature, rather, and of brain science. And this is from one of the great books of Ian McGilchrist. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He has a cult following, which I think is quite large. He is really the most amazing writer. He writes at great length. His books really need strong sinews to hold them, but he's actually quite readable. He's not hard to read. And one thing he talks about, he started off as a literary scholar, and wrote, literature, philosophy, and then he really broke away and studied neuroscience and became a psychiatrist. And that was for the major part of his life. And for this book, he reads all the scholarly work and all the research in neuroscience, including very recent work. And he wants to talk then about two kinds of attention that we human beings give. Animals have the same thing. And he wants to talk about the birds. The fact that we have two kinds of attention that we can pay is because we have two halves to our brain. So we come back to this very old and rather hoary idea that with the two hemispheres of our brain, they stand in a way for different qualities. That idea got very much embarrassed off the stage because it had a very primitive form originally. That one is male and one is female, one is emotional, one's intellectual. No. He's much more subtle, and he's basing himself on neuroscience research. He gives the example of a bird who has two eyes. He has a split brain also, two hemispheres to the brain, and with one eye, and that is the right eye. Now I'll start with the left eye. With the left eye, he is looking in the gravel for the piece of the kernel that he can eat. What's not gravel? Now for that, you need a good sharp eye. In order to eat in the world, if you are a bird, he says, you need both to eat and to stay alive. That means the other eye, the right eye, has the wide view of the world, doesn't focus in narrowly, but looks out at the world for any predators, for anything that's coming at him. And he needs to operate both these eyes at the same time. He points out rather whimsically, he says, well, you can even see the bird swiveling its head in order to privilege the left eye because he's really trying to see. You know, he doesn't want to be, so he kind of turns his head towards the left in order to see in this way. Now, he wants to say, of course, that that's how we operate too. That human beings have in themselves the capacity for two different orders of attention. One is analytical, looking at the part and not at the whole. The other is expansive, comprehensive, looking for the connections between things, looking not only at the world of me, but at the world of others, taking in large spaces. And also, he says, the left eye is not the eyes in general. He wants to say the double use of the eyes is not as a screen. The eye is not a screen on which objects are projected. It's not a passive screen, you know, that things have to make their impact on you, but rather the eye represents the power of making contact with things. The eye is relational, specifically the left eye, which comes from the right brain, right? You know, I think I've got it mixed up. Inevitably, I must be. It's the left eye.
They do cross over.
They do cross over. Thank you.
They do cross over. So if you want, start with the brain. Which side of the brain is the left brain, right brain, and then you can
left brain,
cross it to the eyes.
Cross it to the eyes. That's for sure. But which way around it is, I'm at the moment in embarrassing confusion. I don't know which side of my brain is not functioning. But whichever it is, it's in the world. Clearly, our right hand. Yeah, the right hand comes from the left brain, and the right hand is the one that has power in the world, and the left hand is the one that's a little bit crippled, as it were. But that's the one that takes in. That comes from the left hand is the right brain. And that's the one that takes in the whole world. That's the one that takes in the reality in one large comprehensive gaze. He says, for instance, that then raises the issue of betweenness. How do we operate with between one eye and the other? How do we, what's the space between one and the other? How do we operate in a world in which we need both eyes? And basically his argument also is, his claim is that it's the left eye, the large eye, which comes from the right brain, that should be the master, and the right eye, which comes from, sorry.
Left brain. Right eye, left brain.
Right eye. The narrow, focused, analytic, exploitative, the brain part of the attention that looks for what use can I make of things. I look at something with that calculating look in my eyes. What good will this do me? That's the scientific brain as well, by and large. Not exclusively, but by and large, it means keeping yourself out of it and just focusing on that narrow, simple thing there without taking in the whole landscape. There is certainly a use for that, but he sees that faculty of attention as the servant and the other the master. And he calls the first of his two great books the master and his servant, simply like that. And he thinks that we've lost that sense of priorities, that now we put all our strength into the focused attention, and we've lost that sense of the larger world, of the larger way in which things connect with each other and in which we are connected to the world. Put it very simply, there are different ways in which we can gaze at another person. There are different ways in which God can gaze at the world. When it says vayar, is it the focused, is it the large, or is it both? One feels very uncomfortable when someone looks at one, right, with the focused look of what use can I make of you? I want to know, it's a certain look. It's a certain way of looking. It may not be physically, you may not be able to find, but you can sense it. That this person, his form of attention on you is that look. And then there is the other look, which is the look that we can call the large creative look, the look that looks for connections. Okay, now, in the creating of the world, there is destruction. There comes the flood. And the flood comes clearly as a punishment for sins that human beings have done. The only problem is that we don't see all that many sins clearly and specifically outlined. It's there, but the clear sin, of course, is murder. Cain kills Hevel right away, immediately after the creation story. So, all right, so there is murder. And then there is also, seems to be something to do with sexuality. There are the sons of God and there are the daughters of man, and the world begins to be hechel, right? Several times the word to begin. As huchal likro b'shem Hashem, we read. Then Enosh began to call in the name of God. And that is understood as meaning he began to call everything in the world God. He gave the divine name to objects in the world. In other words, again, that narrow focus. He looked at the object and he said, "Oh, God, no, that's what I'm going to worship." So there is a problem of idolatry in the world, from very early on. There's also murder, and there is also a strange form of sexuality that clearly God doesn't like, that the sons of God see the daughters of men. There's something about men and women, something gendered that is uneasy, that is uncanny, and there seems to be power exercised by the sons of God. Maybe that's what it means, B'nai Elohim. They are simply powerful people in the world who exploit women. Yeah? And so there's this sense of the dangers of power and that everything is running rife in the world. And so we have a sense that life has begun in all sorts of ways and ended up with the three cardinal sins. And the three cardinal sins that were there already, the Midrash comes and says, they were there from very early on. What we have right away is the three cardinal sins and the time of Enosh already. Now, Enosh, let's have a look at your source page now. Number one. It's a long one. I'm just going to pick out certain parts of it. The Midrash here brings a parable of a jar full of grasshoppers, filled with locusts. All right, let's try locusts. One locust climbs the side of the bottle and falls. A second also climbs and falls. Yes, and the third, the same. The third one doesn't learn from the second, and the second doesn't learn from the first. And so you have a theme in this midrash, and I want to put a lot of weight on it, on the idea that what one was supposed to do to avoid destruction, in order to keep the world going, you have to have a live experience of learning from history. That you know you know about people in the past, you've read their stories, you've heard the story of the past. As we read in Sefer Dvarim, the instruction to Moshe that Moshe gives the people just before he departs. And he tells them, Schor yemot olam, binu shnot dor vador. Remember the days of old, understand, utilize your intuition, your large gaze on the years of generation by generation. And there Rashi again says something about the generation of Enosh, already was sinning with avodah zarah, with idolatry. How is it that the generation of the flood didn't learn from them? Now, what the particular sin was is really hard to establish. It doesn't seem as if it was idolatry that the flood generation was guilty of. But the principle seems to be very important, that it is possible and necessary to learn from previous generations. Otherwise, you become like this ridiculous robot-like creature that just acts as if that nothing has happened before you. Everyone in due turn just tumbles into the same traps. Right? Plus ça change, plus la même chose. The more it changes, the more our parent changes, the more it's the same thing. Now, from a certain point of view, I call this the wide focus again. You're not going to find this so clearly written in the text. But the Midrash is blurring out all the details here and saying, you know what this is? This is the incapacity to learn from history, to have history somewhere as part of your world of attention, your field of attention. And these generations absolutely failed to do that, where they might have. In Rashi's version of it, when he quotes this midrash, he says, "Lo nichna lilmod echad min hasheni." Lo nichna. They were not humble enough. They didn't submit to learn from previous generations, which makes me wonder. I have a large wondering here going on. I think I've had it for a long time. Can one learn from other people? In what sense can one really learn from other people? I know you'll want to say, yes, of course. Of course, that's what every moral, ethical environment will tell you. I remember being told by someone I really disliked it, that I would be a role model, excuse me, for other students at Cambridge. I'm really embarrassed to quote this, because I was religious. I think I shouldn't have told them that one. But I remember really thinking, how can one person be a role model for another? Each person has their own world in that sense. I look at someone else, it's not me. I can admire them or the opposite. But a role model, in other words, do I learn from someone by copying them? Is that what it means? Absolutely not, it seems to me. I'll be clear about it. I don't think that's what it means. One example is given in number 2 on your page, and now we really must start moving with the sources because we have quite a booklet here. Number 2, when Yaakov, returning to Eretz Yisrael after his time with Lavan, and he was there for many, many years, as you know, he says, Im Lavan Garti, I dwelt with him, with Lavan. And the word Garti then is, the letters are switched around to form Taryag mitzvot. And so here Rashi says, from the Midrash, I kept all the divine commandments, and I didn't learn from the actions of Lavan. Is it Lavan or Esav? Esav Haraim. Yeah, Esav, sorry. Yeah, Esav. I didn't, Lavan, right? I didn't learn from that. Okay. Now, so it's possible not to learn and to be pleased with yourself for not learning. Maybe it's just What is meant by that? What he really means is, I didn't copy him. But surely it isn't as simple. The idea of learning from someone, learning virtue from someone, isn't as simple as copying them. It can't be as simple as copying them. To learn from someone in a broader sense than simply copying them is what these generations should have done. They should have looked somehow with a wide gaze and in a way that could connect with themselves. Instead, they set themselves on a different path in which the ego was absolutely strong, and that meant that there's no hachna'ah. There is no submission of oneself to a larger picture, no seeing of oneself in a larger context of other people and of relations with other people and of different qualities of relation with other people. That perhaps is a way that one can learn and change about oneself, but it's a very unspecified task here. The only thing we're told is that it needs a kind of humility. It needs an ability to move beyond the narrow focus to something larger. A similar move, if you want to do like that. Let's have Noach now. Noach also, right? Noach, he too begins something new when he comes out of the ark. Like previous generations, where the word began is always somehow ominous. He begins, Vayachel Noach ish Adama. Noach began to be like a man of the earth. We're not quite sure how to understand that. In Perik Tet Pasuk Chaf, what does that mean? He took, let's find the verses. Perik Taf Pasuk Chaf. Yes. This is the first act of Noach after he comes out of the Teva, out of the ark, after the covenant with God. Then we're told that the three sons of Noach, and from them the whole world exploded. Everything came out of them. All the population of the earth descended from them. Vayachel Noach ish Adama, vayita karem, vayesht min hayayin, vayishkar, vayitgal betoch alo, vayar cham. A story of becoming drunk. First of all, planting a vineyard. That was the first thing he did. He also made a new beginning after the flood, but his new beginning was to plant a vineyard, right? A place for what? Ecstasy, a place to go away from himself, a place to flee from himself. He drank wine. He became drunk. He was exposed in his tent. Ham saw him, and he told that his two brothers, and the two brothers then took a garment and covered him and walked out backwards. In other words, not looking. Their form of attention to their father is a respectful form in which they're not looking. They're not using that form of just staring hard at someone. Whereas Ham is enjoying the idea of that kind of mocking, narrow focus on his father's nakedness. And the Midrash comes and says, you have it on the page, number 3. Noach began to be like a man of the earth. What does that mean? God said to Noach, Noach, shouldn't you have learned from Adam HaRishon? Here you have that theme again. You know what happened to Adam HaRishon. And we're left wondering, what did Adam HaRishon do that Noach didn't take account of here? Did he get drunk? We never read that anywhere. Shelo garam lo ela yayin. And suddenly you have a midrashic narrative that we didn't know if we haven't seen it before. Suddenly it comes up at us, and it expands our attention. It grabs our attention, and what? I've got to put these two stories together, because the Eitz Hadat, in the assertion of the Midrash, was a vine. And that was the problem. That's what brought about the fall, if you want to use that expression, which I don't particularly, but you know what I mean. That was the exodus from the Garden of Eden. That it all had to do with wine and getting drunk. Why didn't you learn from that, Noah? The first thing you did was get yourself into the same problem. Now, again, how is he supposed to learn from it if it's not pshat in the text? If you want to put it like that, I'm being cute. It's an interpretation. It's an interpretation, a tradition, if you will. I don't even think that's the right way of looking at it. It's in the field of possibilities that was what the problem, right? I can work with that, but that was the problem. So what should Noah have done? And you notice all the vay's. I tried to emphasize them, and I'll just do a few of them. Vayachal Noach, vayita kerem, vayesh, vayishkar, vayitgal, vayar, and so on. 13 vay's. Vay is whoa. It's a wail. It's a wail of lament, meaning that's what getting drunk does to you. And the Gemara in Brachot, 13 times vay. The Gemara in Brachot says, Rabbi Meir says, that it's nothing brings yilala to the world. Nothing brings wailing to the world, wailing with all it suggests, but wine. Wine is the root of all evil. Wine, the intoxication, that's the thing. Now, it's a view of the human situation. Certainly, it can be responsible for disaster in many, many cases. It's not unknown. But what we have here is a way of setting up something that Noah should have learned from. Now, what does that mean? And I find a clue in the comment of the Torah Tzmima. Rav Horowitz, I think his name was. I've slipped his name. Who points out that Rabbi Meir, apparently this is what it says in the Gemara, that Rabbi Meir made this comment about drinking because he himself had had the experience of being made drunk by his friends who kind of misled him. I don't know the details of the story, but in some way he was got to drink too much, and he realized how illegitimate that is. This is not the way to go. And he realized its bad effects on him. It hadn't been a good thing. And that's what brings him to say this midrash. Now, that could be a very reductive statement, meaning, well, don't pay any attention to this midrash. It just comes from the particular experience or one of the chachamim. Or it could mean just the opposite. It means that the only way that the chachamim learn anything from the text, Ze ba lelamed, they say. This comes to teach us. Does it? No one else has noticed before you said it. But you are pointing out something that speaks to you. You will notice something about the meaning of the text, what it could teach you, if it speaks to you, because you have experienced something in your own life that answers to it. So there's a certain resonance with the text that the Chachamim had. They had a very profound resonance, and that much of their reading of the Torah perhaps comes from on a certain rarefied level. It doesn't have to be as concrete as this. It comes from points of, where the text reaches out to you. There's a connection. It's not just it means, like looking at the chemicals in a vial and saying, this is, and give it the right formula. It's something that my humanity now calls this, like God called light day and darkness night. Right? There's a sense of calling out and a response. So that's, in a way, that's how we have the possibility of learning from another person. Possibility of learning from another person comes then from a sense of empathy with the other person, of noticing ways in which my too muchness, my sense of dis-ease in the world is mirrored in a previous generation. I can see the same things happening there. And then I'm in a position somewhere to connect in a larger sense. I'm emphasizing the painful aspects, the aspects of human experience rather than the joyful ones. Because you don't learn on the whole from the joyful aspects of the past. You learn from the failures of the past. And it's only if one can connect in an imaginative way and bring the word imagination into it with the object that one is studying, which is of course forbidden in the lab. In a research lab, you don't connect emotionally. You don't connect imaginatively. You look at the thing itself, no interference. But in this other form of attention, the only way you can learn and you can say what it teaches is if there is that kind of wider, larger form of attention. I'd like to say also, before we move on to the Tower of Babel, where I want to spend more time, when it comes to when it's the flood comes and undoes what creation did. One of the things that happened in creation is that God, you remember, the very first thing he did after the light was to create Yehi Rakia. He set a firmament, as we translate it. Firmament, really, with the word firm in it. He sets a kind of ceiling between the upper waters and the lower waters, where the universe had been just one mass of water with enormous, meaningless power to it. Now there is a division set in, a compartmentalizing division set in, Yehi Rakia. And now we have Shamayim Ba'aretz. Up there is Shamayim, and down there, here, is earth with its waters, with its lower waters. And up there are the other higher waters, the Mayim Elyonim are up there. Now, it's true that yes, okay, thank you. Okay. It was a reminder about changing the clock, which I already told you.
The upper waters.
The upper waters, thank you.
You said
yes.
it's true that something, and that's where you left off.
Mm-hmm. One moment, yes.
The firmament, firm.
Firm. Okay. Thank you, dear. Okay. What happens in the flood is that the firmament bursts. Right? It's described Bayom hazeh nifka'u kol ma'ayanot tehom rabbah va'arubot hashamayim niftachu. So what separate everything that held the lower waters down in their place and held the upper waters in their place bursts, breaks open, and the two masses of water come together. So that in order that there should be human life, there has to be a division between these two sets of water. There's two. And the word Yehi then means, according to Midrash, which I think Rashi quotes it, I think, yes. He says Yehi means let it become Yechezak, Yikaresh, Yigaled. Let the firmament move from being fluid water to being strong, means solid, something solid up there, solid, crystalline, right? Crystalline and icy, like ice, yeah. You got lead, gel into place. Now these are very concrete words that I used. It's almost humorous. Suddenly we're to imagine, glida up there, something that's frozen ice up there. That is, it's an appeal to the imagination to tell us about our need for differentiation before we can come to exist at all. There can't just be one mass of water. There can't be just echad. There have to be at least two areas. We start with Shamayim Va'aretz. And only after that God goes on to differentiate more and more and more. And that possibility of living in the world comes when everything is in its own place and separated. What the flood does is deconstruct all that, deconstruct forms and shapes and meanings ways, focused ways of looking at the world, and everything becomes one mass, back to the terrifying power of the one mass. God says to human beings, Pru uravu v'shirtzu ba'aretz. Be fruitful and multiply and swarm in the world. Now, swarm, God is telling the first single human being, and then later Noach after the flood. Pru uravu, again, you got it on your page, look at the number 4. Vayivarech otam Elokim. Pru uravu umil'u et haaretz v'kivshuha uradu b'dgat hayam. Right, you should become many and conquer the world, master the world, over the fish and the fowl and every animal that's romeset ala aretz. So from your point of view, you will be much higher than all these creatures. In a sense, all animals, I think it's possible to read this way, from your point of view, will be like romsim. They will be like creepy crawlies. They will be much lower than you. Remes is something down there that's crawling down there. And you will look from your sublime height down on them. And that's what it means to have power, that you are greater than them, you are higher than them. And yet God says, you should pru uravu. And then after the flood, he says, v'shirtzu. He adds the word v'shirtzu ba'aretz. And become like shratzim, which gives you the sense of the come down that's involved in that horizontal movement, where you will move out over the surface of the earth and you will fill it again where it's been emptied. Basically, all human beings have gone down into the water. And Noach, who has been left, Ach Noach, Vayishaer, Ach Noach, is the one human being, like Adam in the world before Eve. He is Ach Noach, and God therefore tells him, and it's a blessing and a demand. But the first thing you have to do is get together with your wife again and shirtzu. Create that horizontal spread out there, which in a way diminishes your vertical grandeur, your sense of power. So on the one hand, you are to have that kind of looking down at everything, a fantasy of dominion, of domination. And at the same time, you are to know that you really belong with all procreating, spawning, teeming creatures. Now I'm using words in English that to me are very crunchy words. To teem, I love that word, T-E-E-M, to swarm. What is it? It's to move. It's the kind of involuntary movements, it seems. Rashi says, it says, they look, insects, as they move, they look as if they're nigrarin, as if they're being dragged. They don't look, you can't see their legs moving, as if they're voluntarily moving. You just see the masses sweeping around, and for no good reason, in this direction and that direction. And that's from our point of view, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing something that has to do with movement, with something involuntary, and with manyness, the becoming many. On the other hand, to be solitary is to be great. Have a look at Gaston Bachelard, the last source on your page. In English, number 12. Gaston Bachelard is a philosopher who bases himself very much on he uses imagery, what he calls the concrete imagination in his philosophy. From the solitude of a belfry tower, a man watches other men running about on the distant square, bleached white by the summer sun. A belfry tower is high up. The men look the size of flies and move about irrationally like ants. A belfry daydream, he calls it. It's a fantasy that we have of the solitary philosopher, gives him an impression of domination at little cost. If I'm at the top of a tall tower and I look down, I have a feeling of uncanny power. I remember from my childhood, I think, and at some point reading one of the Father Brown detective stories. I don't know if any of you have ever read any of those. G.K. Chesterton, about someone who is killed, is found dead, and Father Brown understands that someone was on the top of the tower and dropped a hammer on him from the top of the tower, and that's the solution of the detective story. How did he get killed? By a little hammer, which couldn't have done very much, but it's thrown from a great height. And that, for Bachelard, is the image of knowledge and power, an impression of domination at little cost. This is specifically the dream of high solitude, right? You could say it's a kind of masculine dream. It's a dream of high solitude. From the top of his tower, a philosopher of domination sees the universe in miniature. Everything is small because he is so high. And since he is high, he is great. The height of his station is proof of his own greatness. That is, these are all terms of fantasy, of course. We're talking here about fantasy. Because I'm so high, I'm great. And because I'm so great, I'm powerful. And what God does to Adam is a two-part instruction, and he repeats it to Noah. On the one hand, with Adam certainly, with both of them, they are made in the image of God. Adam is not told he's in the image of God. He is told just pru'uruvu. Your job now is to become many, to compromise your solitary domination of the world, to take into yourself, to make a connection with something else outside of yourself, which will result in the word I want, the fact that you then will become obsolescent. You will create children, and grandchildren, and you will become somewhere marginal. That is to be part of the rhythm of things. Ezer kenegdo, someone who in a way brings man down to the earth. When it comes to Noah, God tells Noah that he's created in the image of God. He is the first human being to be told. Have a look now at number 6. I'm going to be dotting around a bit now. Number 6. And we're moving towards the Tower of Bava. Hu haya Omer, Rabbi Akiva. Very well known. Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. Special is the human being who's created in the image of God, or special, as they say these days. Oh, it's so special. Excuse my superciliousness. Beloved, Chaviv, adorable, lovely, is the human being who's created in the image. Chibayitera, but a special specialness, even more special, or very, as this is really cringeworthy. People love to say, including very well-educated people, it was very unique. This was very unique, very, very unique, very special. Is to become conscious that you are created in the image of God. Because now what you're being invited to do is to use your own consciousness and your own imagination and your sensibility to ask yourself, what does that mean? To be created in the image of God, well, God knows what he means by that. He's talking to himself. He's talking to us. Okay, and we learn from it, maybe. But here, who does God tell it to, of all people? Noah, who has seen how nothing the human being is, how he's made into the waves of the sea. He just disappears forever. Bala, he's simply disposable. And it's Noah who's told, but the same human being is made in the image of God. And at the same time, be fruitful and multiply, and shirtzu. Don't give up on the horizontal aspect of things as you hold the vertical one. But on the one hand, you and I are in some way good friends. We're hin on some. What that would mean, I don't know. Everyone has had his own different interpretation of it. The Rambam says one thing, and the Maharal says another thing, and I'm sure. In other words, we have to bring our own experience and our own imagination to work. to understand what does that mean? Another of my memories. I was told by my parents when I was very very young that I saw the photograph of my mother's father, my grandfather, and he looked very venerable. He was a Rav. He was, the real thing. And my mother would tell me that I am like him. Well, looking with a narrow gaze, narrow focus, I couldn't see any resemblance at all. This old man with a long white beard, which means that I began to be haunted by what she said. What does that mean? And I gave it my own interpretations. I looked at myself. I looked into myself, at the good things and the not so good things, and I felt a bond develop. Is that scientific? Does that hold any water? I don't know, but it means it creates life. It creates something rather than simply describing something obvious. With this, I wanted to go to the Tower of Babel. That was the flood. The generation is called Dor HaFlagah, the generation of the dispersal of human beings over the face of the earth. Right? Again, that movement from the vertical to the horizontal. What is the generation of the Tower of Babel? There are Migdal. They build an Ir or Migdal. Ir is horizontal, you might say. It expands outwards. There's a certain space that's taken up by the city. And Migdal is vertical, up to the heavens. Rosh Hashanah, up, right, all the way up to the heavens. Now, this is mythic language. The Midrash interprets it in all kinds of ways, that in some way it was an attack on God, or it was an act of aggression against God. I'm not necessarily going to be talking about that. But it's clearly vertical, right? If you will, phallic, if you want to make the point in that way. So both, they made an Ir and a Migdal. Migdal has the word gadol in it, right? So that represents height and greatness on some level. They should have learned from the generation of the flood. Didn't we see that? Dor haflaga lo lamdu. They didn't learn. Let me insert a detail here that I wanted to say earlier, and that is when I said that the flood wasn't the first real punishment. The Midrashic tradition is that in the time of Enosh, a third of the world went under the ocean. There was a kind of proto-flood. There was a kind of mini flood. A long time before the flood, early warning. There was an early warning system, and they didn't learn. So there you have the idea then of learning in its moralistic sense, and then with the mystery that comes with it. So here, Dor HaFlagah should have learned from the Tower of Babel. Well, I thought they did. Isn't it wonderful what they did? The Tower of Babel was guilty. The flood generation was guilty of incest, sexual problems of all kinds, miscegenation between bestiality, all kinds of mess. A messing up of the clear language of sexuality, that each has its own kind, as it were. Okay, that was the problem there. Here, it's wonderful. There's no mixing up. Everyone is together, and they are described, first of all, as safa achat. Let's have a look at it. Very good, Aleph. What was their condition? To start with, anyway. Vahi kol haaretz. Everyone in the world became safa achat udvarim achadim. The famous opening words. One language, vayihi. It was. There was one language and one words. Devarim achadim, not with the modern sense of a few. Achadim will not do to translate a few words. No. It means one in the plural. It means with all the many things they were saying, they were really only saying one thing. Everyone was saying the same thing. They had the same language. All right, I understand. So there's a clarity there. Everything you might say then is lucid. People understand each other. There's no problem in understanding each other. Now, this clearly is different from the way the world is now. The aim of these stories, it seems to me, is that we should learn from them. We should learn from them, meaning that we should take them personally, that we should think, what is there in me and my world that in some way answers to this experience? Isn't that what I've been trying to, in some way, imply? Yes? So what would be a state of things in which people weren't mastering each other all over the place? Men weren't grabbing women, for their own pleasure. People weren't stealing from one another. These are all the sins of the flood generation. Here, it's wonderful. They have a unified society in which there's one language, Esperanto, let's say, which is the great dream of the ultimate development of human history, that we'll all speak the same language, or AI, if you will, or maybe I'd better not touch that. That a sense somewhere of a master language, which everyone takes part of. And they moved from the east, and they found a valley, a deep, low place in the earth, in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. So a whole migration of all, almost like insects, almost like creatures that come in from, suddenly you find masses of them moving, migrating, and they all come together. And what's the instinct that's driving them? Somewhere to be the opposite, to make themselves impregnable to a future flood. Now that's the Midrashic view, that what they're trying to do is say, that we are afraid, they even have it scientifically worked out. I think Rashi quotes this. Yes, he says, literally, one of the things they said was every 1656 years, somehow they know that's the time since the flood. They've counted the years, and they somehow come to the conclusion that we're due for another flood. Like we now think that we are due for another earthquake. It's going to happen again. And they are now making themselves impregnable by all gathering together, moving inwards and upwards from that completely widespread, vulnerable existence of human beings. And they find a valley and they settle down there. And then they say to one another, Hava, come. Rashi translates that, Hazminu et atzmechem. Invite yourselves. In other words, gather your forces, prepare yourselves. We are now going to engage in a project. This is the project of our civilization. And the Hava here, it will be echoed ironically by God a little later. Hava, let's now come and make bricks, and let us put them in the firing kiln and fire them, right? Fire the bricks in a kiln, in a furnace. And that will produce then bricks, which will become stone. Instead of stones, they'll use the bricks instead of stones. And the clay they have becomes stuff that sticks the stones together. In other words, they are not going to build with stones because there are no stones there, apparently. And so they go about using the strategies of civilizations to create a technology which can create something in place of stones. It's an artificial stone. In other words, this is a highly civilized culture. Right? It's not a low culture that just disappears in the waters, where everyone's behaving like animals and worse. It's the opposite. They've got everything worked out. And Hava livneh lanu ir umigdal. That's the next Hava. Gather yourselves together and make yourselves focus on this one thing, a city and a tower with its top in the heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves. That's a very Na'aseh lanu shem. Has to do with language, has to do with a cultural project. Na'aseh lanu shem pen nafutz al panei haaretz. Lest we scatter over the whole earth. It's clear what they're doing is a defensive measure. They don't want to be scattered. Nafutz, to scatter for them is associated, rightly, with the idea of hatzafa, hafatza, hatzafa, of being drowned. In other words, if you are thin on the ground all over the place, then you can easily be flooded. Then God can do his thing again, and there'll be no problem in getting rid of humanity again. So we want now to concentrate ourselves and to become impregnable to that kind of attack. And they build this ear, the city and this tower, and God descends to see again, to see the city and the tower. God focuses his attention, vayar. He comes down to do it from his high heavens. In other words, they haven't really got into his sphere. He has to come down into the world of which is an insect world. From his point of view, he is the one who is high up. He is the only one who is high up in that sense. But he speaks in the plural, notice. Nerda, hava, nerda. Look, there's only one, one made themselves into one nation and one language for all of them. That's what they've begun to do. And now nothing will be cut up, there'll be no stopping them, right? Whatever they have plotted to do, they will manage to achieve. In other words, they've started something, there will be no stopping. There's a kind of force involved in this human action. Hava nerda v'navla sham svatam. Come, let us go down, descend, and confuse their language. Navla svatam, so that no one will understand the language of his friend. And the builders of the tower, the famous midrash, one will ask for a brick, and the other one will give him clay. Ask for a hammer, and you get clay. And he will break his head. Suddenly there'll be intense animosities set up because of this confusion of language. Why does God do this? And in the plural, let us go down. Let us go down, Rashi comments. This is to show you the extreme uninvitanut of God, the extreme democratic persona of God, that God doesn't speak in the solitary singular, ironically, that he involves the angels. He speaks to his Beit Din. He co-opts his court of angels. And he says, now we shall do this. And by that, and that's how God created man too, Na'aseh Adam. In the creation of the human being, when the human being relates then to God and asks, what is it in me that is in the image of God? Partly it becomes a matter of choice. Is it that in me that wants to be godlike and powerful and single and singular and dominant? Or is it the God who makes himself, as it were, one of us, the pru urevu v'shirtzu, the people who are separating and spreading all over the earth? They are disobeying, from this point of view, they are disobeying God's will, because God said shirtzu. God said, now, if you have a look at some of the sources, we'll do this quite quickly. I want to look at number 7 on the tower. Okay, let's start with that. The Mea Shiloach. He tells a story about how they all move to one place. This is their project, to go to one place so that doom can never overcome them. Right? They'll be in a way impregnable. But what do they choose as their site, their building site? The place in the world, this is really gruesome, where all the dead of the flood were shaken down. Shenin Arusham. Shinar, the place is called Shinar, and there's a play on words. Shenin Arusham, all the corpses of the flood were shaken down to that lowest place in the world. They simply, the agitation of the waters simply drove them down there. And it's on the basis of all that death, right? They're learning from the past, aren't they? All right, they choose to build their tower on top of that. Now, if you want to reach the heavens, you probably are well advised not to build in a valley, and certainly not to build in the lowest place in the world. And the lowest place geographically becomes the lowest place spiritually here, or psychologically. It is to build in a place of absolute fear of what God can do to me, which is the basic motive of religion. Somewhere, a sense of the early development of religion, where faith in God and the relationship with God is based with the God who can do what he likes, God of power, right, the God of dominion, and is based on absolute fear. And based on that, they base their whole civilization on fear. And the Meir Shalach then says that's the opposite of the Beit HaMikdash. What is the structure that God likes? Not this tower, but it's a high place. It's built on a mountain. It's not built on a low place. It's a place where people can have a sense of loftiness, that they are themselves united in a place of in a lofty place, in a place of sublimity. Why do they base themselves low down there and not in any higher place? Shelo yirtzruchu lira, strangely, that they shouldn't be able to have a rightful fear of God, which is involved with its opposite. Love of God, fear of God, a sense of likeness to God, a sense of unlikeness from God, right? The complexity of what God wants of human beings. A place of artificial unity, that everyone's together in one place. Achdut neged ritzono lo yitkayem, he says. Unity, which sounds like an unequivocal good, there's such a thing as a unity against God's will. God wants us spread out. He wants us many. He wants us procreating. He wants us wide focus. In some way, looking always to understand what is not just viscerally imprinted in me, a kind of imprinted terror of the gods, but what the Meir Shalach calls avodah. What happened in the Beit HaMikdash was worship, or you might even say work. They didn't want, very simply, to have to change themselves. They wanted to be as they are, to get together, right? All together, all the same. They understand each other's language. They can never, therefore, change. And that is strength. What God likes is a place in which they have to somewhere learn to fear. It doesn't come viscerally. It comes from a kind of appreciation of the complication, the complexity of how one is made. That there are parts of one that are troublesome, that there are parts of one where one feels stuck, and those places then become fruitful. And God helps in that by showing that he too can be troubled, that he too can be ambivalent about things, that he too is in two minds, right? The Midrash says this. He's in two minds whether to destroy or to create. Ha'im, one thing or the other. That's how God is projected in these early narratives. In a way, God is B'Tselem Adam in these early narratives, so that we can connect and so that we can in some way begin to understand that that is the basic human divine material. The human material that is in the image of God contains complexities. And it's only in the complexities that there can be depth. We don't look only to mimic what's up high, to say we dominate in a kind of physical way, but instead we become aware of the tehumot, of the depths in us that can be closed off or can be opened judiciously, like the nekavim, chalalim, of our bodies, yes, that have to be open in the right way and closed. All that's work. So it's human material that has to be worked with. And this generation of human beings are extremely defensive, I would say. That they are defensive in a survivalist mode, and they just don't want the mabul to happen to them. So they go to the opposite extreme. And now you have a Migdal. And what does this Migdal ultimately represent? My time is getting very short. I want to look with you at the Sforno in number 9. Number 9 goes on. The Hamek Gavar will come to after that. That is a really long passage, so we're going to have to do some significant skipping. Number 9, Sforno. This is what they've begun to do, says God. This is a beginning that has been arrived at by total consent of all of them, not one dissenter. And now there'll be no stopping them. Look at the next passage. From finishing, from consummating their plan. You will have the perfect communist society. You will have the perfect totalitarian society in which there's only one voice, in which everyone will have the same view of things. And no one, lo yifne echad mehem ladat et abore. And there will be no one of them, no singular, single human being who emerges from the mass and turns his face away from the mass and turns to ask questions, right? Ladat et abore, to know God. Instead, everyone will be involved in this, in a way, horrifying unity. Not necessarily compelled, although it turns out that there is a Kifshan Ha'esh there. And the Me'ah Shiloach, the Hasidic commentary we looked at before, actually goes as far as to say that what you have there in that fiery furnace where the bricks were made, why is that mentioned here? Because that is a description of what Abraham fought against and was saved from. And it represents the totalitarian state, the totalitarian culture in which the dissident individual goes into a furnace. That's what the furnace is for the Echad among them. Now, this Echad, who is Abraham, who will be Abraham, who's, right, the prophets call Abraham Echad. Echad Haya Abraham, in Yecheskel, for instance. Abraham was Echad, not in the sense that the whole of civilization became Echad. He was the dissident. He was the singular human being who turned away from a society that had settled, the Sforno will say, on one famous idol of the ancient world. He refers to the name of the idol, that really encompassed the large expanse of the world. And you had this kind of dangerous unity. There was no possibility of anyone thinking for himself. And what you needed, he goes on to say, I'm paraphrasing okay. What he goes on to say is that what you number 9b, yes, the only solution for a society of that kind, what saves Abraham, is the possibility of machloket. Now, this is really ironic, paradoxical. The possibility of discussion, argument, difference. In a society in which there is no argument, there is no difference of opinion, there's no differentiation, there is no possibility of a true coming together. And Abraham finds himself in such a society completely unable to grow. He's suffocated in such a society. To grow would mean to differentiate, right? Different views around you, argue with them, and become more and more aware of what you think. Right? You have a sense of being sharpened by the contrasts of people around you. In avoiding the flood, in a way, God is saying, the people in the world, the populations of the world, have turned their backs on the possibility of human growth, which means a spiritual growth as well, a growth where one person, it'll have to start with one person, who thinks differently from those around him. It's very difficult for an Abraham to emerge from such a society. And that's what God, in a way, makes easier by foiling their plan of unity, by scattering them over the face of the earth and creating many languages. If you have many languages, you're going to need translation, you're going to need interpretation, and you are never going to fully know the other. Right? If I speak French, and you speak Italian, we can do our best, and there can come someone who can translate me into you, and that will be, in a way, a third language. That will be a way of bringing some aspects of the source language into the host language and creating a yitzur of its own. That creature, what is left of the tower? Have a look at number 10, I think it is on the page. What is left of the tower? Gemara in Sanhedrin, number 10. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Migdal, Shlish Nisraf, Shlish Nivra, Shlish Kayam. A third of the tower. And we're interested in threes here. Right? Do you remember a third of the world was destroyed in the time of Enosh? We're interested in three-part things here. Not just one, not just two, but something that bridges between two who are separate. Call it imagination, call it intuition, call it wide focus stare, a blurring effect where you in your difference are there, but I'm capable of seeing beyond the difference in a way. So a third of it is left. One was swallowed up, one was burned. Amarav, the air of a tower makes you forget. Strange statement, and I want to finish with this. The atmosphere of a tower makes you forget language, blurs out the possibilities of language becoming languages, and therefore acquiring much greater force and power in the interplay, in what's between the languages. If you only have one ideology, you begin to forget everything that you know. Mishaker et halimud, says Rashi on this Gemara. Et halamud. You can't learn from anything. If you have that kind of totalitarian ideology and you're stuck in it, then your words in the end become babble. You think you can speak very clearly then. You speak in slogans. But look what happens when you begin to speak in slogans. You begin to speak in slogans, the words empty out. The words empty out the more you use them in a meaning that everyone can understand. If there is no, in other words, I'll translate this now into psychoanalytic language. If there is only conscious, blatant reality, what everyone understands as being the same thing, then something desperate has happened to what we call the unconscious. All that level of being in oneself that makes one a person, capable of growth, of meanings that are not fully understood and that can never be conveyed, the depths, in other words, all that, in a way, is defensively closed off in this totalitarian creation of this generation. They did learn from the past, but they learned defensively and not creatively. And so we're left now with a sense that a third of the tower remains, a third of it being a recognition, on the one hand, of the part, and on the other hand, of the whole, the focused look, the other large look, and then somewhere the attempt to bring them together. Sometimes one, sometimes the other, but then a kind of conversation between the two, so that it's not exactly oscillating between the two. I think that would be one stage where you just, and we want to talk about this in the future, what the oscillating would be. Sometimes I tend to do that. I can't see both things at the same time. And so I look at that, and then I see it that way. I'll bring some pictures next time. But ideally, it gets beyond that. And it gets to a stage where one has grown sufficiently to be able to take in at the same, with one immediate comprehensive gaze, both the part and the whole, both the ego and the larger connections between things. And that is the stage of things that's waiting to happen. God himself is split. Comes the mabul, he's not sure, destroy, not. And the human being, by beginning to look into his own depths, is able perhaps then to begin to identify with the mabul condition, the mabul fantasy, the Migdal fantasy, on the other hand, and the way in which they contradict each other and prevent each other, or perhaps can be included in some way in a kind of conversation, in some more active and kinetic form, where it's come alive. In other words, as Winnicott would say, in the play of things. We're talking about the play when we look at two curtains, the way that the edges play with each other. And you look at the sense of movement and of merging and of separating that can happen between two very different functions of the mind. And Abraham, in this scheme of things, is going to be the person we're waiting for. We're going to be waiting for someone who can take on himself the difficult and perhaps, and apparently in this view of things, original, right? He is the first person, Avram Haya Echad, like God was Echad at the beginning, who can begin then the real work. And the real work being the work of growth, the work of becoming what you were not before, and yet being who you are, of recognizing strangeness in yourself. That's not me, but it is me. I'll stop there. Do you have comments, questions? If you have time, I have time. I know that was a lot.
I'd like to share
Yeah.
something, Avivah.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Going back to what you were talking about at the beginning about the hemispheres of the brain and their different functions.
Yes.
I learned some years ago through the practice of yoga that you can get the two hemispheres working together by doing things like alternate nostril breathing or even just cross body tapping. There's something about taking the right hand to the left side and the left hand to the right side and doing that gets the two hemispheres working together. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I find that if I do this before I daven, that it really enhances my prayer experience. And I feel like my devekut is more switched on. And I just wanted to mention it, especially to this group, because you might find a similar effect. Bertie.
Many, many thanks. Yes. I mean, those disciplines, I had a recent experience myself of that kind in shiatsu. It's extraordinary. And it's extraordinary in this way, exactly. It's a very body-based way of breaking through in this way. But of course, what we have in the Torah is a different kind of work. But there is a connection. Yeah.
Avivah?
Yes.
Ruthie. So I'd like to share something that I was pushed to see by Tzvi Grummet just a few days ago.
Okay.
So looking at the first few psukim of Bereshit, and he pushed us to say, well, what is Erev? Vayihi Erev, Vayihi Boker. It's like, okay, so what do those words mean? What is Erev? Well, we say evening, but that's not what it means. And to Boker is morning, but that's not what it really means. So I realized Erev is mixture. Everything was a mixture. Vayehi Boker. And then it was Elohim when he made distinctions. Levaker is to distinguish.
Yes.
So there was a mixture, and then there was a distinction, and that is the progress of the Bereshit story. Each Yom is another level of making a distinction, a separation, this from this, this from this, a progressive making distinctions, which I never thought of before. And then you have Yom Echad. It is the day of oneness.
Oh, oneness.
It was that time, the one time that everything was one. And then from there, you got more than one.
Yes.
I just wanted to share that.
I think it's actually not even a stretch. I think there's something if one has really found one's rhythms in the Hebrew, in the biblical language, there it is. I think it has been said. I seem to have come across it, but thank you very much. Yes, I think that's certainly, you know, that doubleness there in the Yom Echad. Yeah, beautiful.
Thank
Avivah,
you.
Avivah, I just also want to bring to the attention that when you looking at a narrow focus versus a broad focus, I'm very interested in that in terms of meditation. And I think that if you really focus, it's a certain type of meditation that you do with two people facing each other, that you can really start to experience that. You initially you're looking at the eyes, and then after a while you really focus on the more of the body, the face, the body, and the emotions, perhaps even what's behind the face. So I just, based on what you were saying, I'm anxious to see the artwork that you bring in next week, because I think it's really true to the visualizations that you can see against another person that really bring this to light. Thank you.
Another person. Yeah, I see. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
And Chodesh Tov to you.
Okay, shall we say Chodesh Tov?
Everyone.
I should mention that I'm very open to being written to. If anyone feels they'd like to say something, you could always write me email, Zorenberg@netvision.net.il. Zorenberg@netvision.net.il. So if that moves you, I'm always happy to read what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Kodesh Tov, Kodesh Tov.
See you next week.